Hello everyone, this is Ashley Tucker. Thank you for joining me today. Recently I picked up a bunch of alcohol inks, so I thought I would do a little series this week focusing on them. This is my first time using alcohol inks, so I have been experimenting and learning and making lots of mistakes. The kind of paper that you want to use with your alcohol ink is this Yupo paper, and this is the Ranger brand of Yupo paper. Yupo paper is a synthetic paper which you can't really tear, and it's kind of like a plastic. When you work with alcohol inks, you want to protect your work surface. I'm going to be working on my craft mat. I started out by just putting little drops of ink onto this page. All of the alcohol inks that I'm going to be using in this series are Ranger alcohol inks. And this is the Ranger alcohol blending solution. You can see how when you put the alcohol blending solution on the paper, it spreads out the ink and lightens it and moves it around. So for this piece, I just keep adding little droplets of ink and blending solution until I get it to a point where I'm happy with it. Playing with alcohol inks is so fun and kind of addicting. I was up way too late making tons and tons of these backgrounds. At some points I took a straw and I came in and I blew air on the ink to get it moving, and you'll kind of see my head in the video a little bit. And apparently I had really messy hair this night. I wanted to add little tiny dots of the ink around the edges, so I took my pick-me-up tool and I took the pointy end of it and went into these little puddles that I had and picked up the ink there and dropped it on the outside to have little dots on the outside. When you use alcohol inks, you really need to be in a ventilated area. You want to have like a window open or like good airflow, because if you don't, you can get it's not good for you to breathe it in. And I kind of, after a little while, I got a little bit lightheaded, so I probably should have had a little bit more airflow. I finished the first background and set it off to the side to dry, and then I started on the second panel. This background was where I started getting a little bit more experimental, trying to learn more about these inks, and I did make a lot of mistakes on this panel, but I learned a lot too. One thing I learned on this panel was sometimes you should stop when you're ahead. I really liked the way that this was looking in the beginning, and then I just went too far at some point, and it just started, I started hating it. But the great thing about the alcohol inks and the Yupo paper is you can pretty much start over if you want to, and that's what I end up doing, and I'll show you how I do that. One little tip I'd like to mention is that when you're putting your alcohol inks on the paper, in between putting each ink on, you should put the cap back on it every single time. And I learned this the hard way because I wasn't always putting the cap back on, and some of the ink actually got onto my work surface, which is like a wooden table, and it stained my table. Another thing that I'm going to do in the future is I'm always going to put the ink bottle into my tin. I have a little tin that I keep all of my alcohol inks in, and I'm just going to keep them in there in between uses and never set them on my work surface, just to protect my table, because I don't want it to have tons of stains on it. So right here you can see that I'm using a little tiny paintbrush to do little splatters of the different color inks, and also to do little splatters of the alcohol blending solution. And I was really liking this piece up to this point, and then I just took it too far. Here's another tip. When your craft mat gets really dirty, you can clean it a lot easier by using some alcohol or even some of that blending solution. It gets it right off your craft mat. So with this piece, there were times where I loved it, and then I hated it because I just went too far, and then I would fix it by adding a bunch of solution, and then I would add more ink and I'd hate it again. It was a lot of mistakes with this piece. You'll see in a minute that I absolutely mess up this whole piece. But here's the great thing about Yupo paper and alcohol inks. If you take some alcohol, or in this case I used the blending solution, and you go over the whole thing like a ton, and you use a paper towel and wipe it away, you can pretty much start over. So that's pretty much what I did here. And you know, the paper is a little bit stained. It's kind of pink, but that's okay. I made it work. So I do eventually get this to a point where I like it. It's definitely not my favorite out of the backgrounds I made. It's probably the one that is my least favorite, but I do like it. And so you can keep going and getting your piece to a point where you like it. You'll see here in a sec that I pick this panel up and I see the back of it, and I love the way the back looks. And I wanted to make a card out of the back, but then I tried to fill in that white space and I ruined the back. So I think a lot of what I learned with this piece is to leave things alone when I like them. I'm going to trim down these two panels that I created, and I'm going to trim them a lot because I wanted to make a lot of cards from these. I didn't want to waste, I wanted to waste as little of these pieces as possible. So for each one of these panels, I cut it at 4 1/4 so that I had one piece that was 5 by 2 3/4 and one piece that was 5 by 4 1/4. And then I took the piece that was 5 by 4 1/4 and I cut that diagonally so I could, and from these pieces I'm going to make 3 different cards. After I had all of those pieces cut, I'm going to just take my ATG gun and glue them right onto the card bases. So from these 2 backgrounds that I created, I'm actually going to be making 6 different cards. The 2 smaller panels that I cut, I ended up trimming those so that they are 4 1/4 by 2 3/4. So there ended up being very little of these panels that I wasted. And that's how I wanted it. They were so, they were so fun to make, and I really liked them, and I didn't want any of them to go to waste. The next thing that I did for each of these cards is I trimmed out a piece of white cardstock to be popped up with some foam tape. And those different pieces of white cardstock are different shapes depending on the kind of look I was going for each card. For the first card, I used a die that says thank you, and I cut it out of this blue paper. And then I used my Tombow glue to glue it onto the white part of the card. And it hangs off the side a little bit, but that's okay. And the next thing I did was I went over it with my Wink of Stella to give it a little glitter. For the next card, I used a die that says Sunshine, and I also heat embossed a sentiment on a strip of blue cardstock, which says Sending, so that I can create the sentiment Sending Sunshine. That Sending stamp is from the Here Arts kit from March 2018. And I'm going through these kind of fast because there are a lot of cards, and I didn't want this video to be ridiculously long. I went over both of these sentiments with my Wink of Stella too. For the next card, I took this die which says Hugs, and I cut it out multiple times. I think I did 3, and then I glued them all together, so this just makes it a little bit more sturdy and it gives it some dimension. And then I glued it onto the card with my Tombow glue. To give it even more dimension and a little bit of a shine, I went over that die cut with my glossy accents. It's a very simple card, but it's probably my favorite. That finishes up the 3 cards that I made from the blue, green, and yellow background. So here's a look at all 3 of those. For the next card, I used this die which says Congrats, and I cut it out of some purple cardstock, but I wanted to give it a little bit more depth, so I used one of my distress inks this is the Dusty Concord color, and I went over the bottom of it, just the bottom of it, to give it kind of an ombre look. And I glued it onto my card, and I went over it with Wink of Stella. For the next card, I wanted to test out how well embossing would work on the Yupo paper. It did work for me, but there was one thing that I did notice. When I used my heat tool, the Yupo paper started to warp. And the way that it warped is a lot different than the way that normal paper warps. It's kind of like it almost melted a little bit, and the color from like the alcohol ink started kind of like curling up, like a part of it started curling up away from the paper. So you'll see on the edge there on the side this little white spot, and that's where the color started melting and curling back. It wasn't super noticeable in this situation, and I did go over it with a red marker to hide it, so it kind of worked for me. But if you decide to use Yupo paper and emboss on it, you're going to want to be careful. I would only do a very small amount of embossing, and try to keep your heat tool on it as little as possible. Anyways, you'll see that I used a die cut that says love, so the sentiment reads lots of love, and then I put 3 little sequins on the white part of the card there. For the next card, I die cut this sentiment that says hello, and I glued it onto the white part of the card. And then to give this sentiment a little bit more depth, I took one of my purple Arteza markers and colored in along the bottom. And I left just a little bit of it, the original color, so that it's two-toned. And I also added a few sequins to this card. And then these 3 cards from this panel are complete, and here's a look at those 3 cards. So like I said in the beginning of this video, I'm going to be doing a little series this week on alcohol inks. So I normally do a video every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, but because I'm doing this little series on the alcohol inks, I've decided to do a few extra videos this week. So I'm going to be back with another video tomorrow on Tuesday. Thank you for watching today. I hope you really enjoyed this first part of my alcohol inks series. All of the supplies that I used in this video can be found in the description down below. If you enjoyed watching, please be sure to hit the subscribe button so that you can see all of my future videos. Again, thank you for watching, and I hope the rest of your day is wonderful.